Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for holding this important committee. I know that committees with this subject matter are few and far between. I think it's very important. I think it's particularly important because one of the things that I want to talk about, we can talk about trade opportunities, we can talk about a number of other things, but if we don't start lifting this regulatory burden and the additional barriers that we have, it'll be a moot point because our farmers won't be able to produce protein and export it. We're reaching a very dangerous point. That's something I want to focus on. You know, I travel across North Carolina, and, you know, back in the day, you'd be talking about the cost of feed, you'd be talking about the prices of the beef and pork and poultry. Now you talk about EPA regulations, you talk about FDA regulations, you talk about USDA regulations, and all the impediments that are making it virtually impossible for farmers to continue to do what they want to do, which is produce the most abundant, safe food supply in the world. If I appear to be a little bit angry about it, it's because I am. I mean, we've got a few committee hearings that almost focus on who's in Grant's tomb. We know who's in Grant's tomb. We know what regulations need to be changed. We know a number of things we have to get focused on, and Congress has to act. And Mr. Hill, I want to start with you on the GIPSA rule. And I'd like for you, if you could, maybe to explain it briefly, very briefly, in kitchen table terms so people can understand how this rule affects the farmers and maybe the person who would purchase their products. And then after you do that, I'd like for you to tell me whether or not the USDA has reached out to you and your organization about the latest livestock marketing practices and how the 2010 rule, which we successfully pushed back, will be updated for 2016 modern practices. And also, if you have an opportunity, give me an idea whether or not the USDA has indicated, you or your organization, what will be included in the rule.
Yeah, well, thank you. Anticipating this might be a question, I contacted the CEO of the National Pork Producers Council and asked him if USDA had contacted our organization or the National Pork Board. And to his knowledge, we have not had any direct contact with USDA.
So we have a sweeping regulation. They haven't consulted with major organizations to understand what the modern rule would need to look like not to be disruptive.
Does that surprise you?
Not at all.
No.
But it angers me, but it doesn't surprise me. I mean, this is just another example of where these regulators need to get out. They need to go and talk to these farmers and understand that this regulation is disruptive in a time when we have so many other disruptive forces that they need to actually go and talk to the people that are producing safe food and modernizing their practices, and they cannot continue to disrupt what you're doing. And we'll submit another question for the record for you to follow up. Mr. Bruner and Dr. Hill, I also want to talk a little bit about biotech, and I want to talk about the relationship to the Vermont law and the patchwork of another 20 or 30 other states that could come in, that if proteins are not exempted from these labeling practices, can you give me some sense of what this is going to do to the industry in terms of reformulation practices? You know, we had to beat down the cool regulations last year. This could be another mandatory product labeling initiative, another burden on our farmers. Can you give me an idea of how, if we don't act, how this is going to affect your business operations and maybe future prices? Well, Mr. Bruner, we'll start with you.
I think that's a very good example. The mandatory country of origin labeling, failed experiment, left us with increased industry costs and facing $1.1 billion in tariffs from our two best trading partners. I believe there's a huge lesson to be learned there from trying to furnish something to consumers that they're not willing to pay for. Specifically to the beef industry, it takes somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 to 100 bushel of corn per animal to finish those animals.
And 90+% of the corn produced in the United States is a product of biotech engineering. Is that correct?
Exactly, sir.
So you're not going to reformulate, and there's not enough corn grown in the other category to feed these cows.
And there's no way to identity preserve without adding very significant cost. It would, it's just commercially impossible.
Mr. Hill, you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think
I
would think it'd have the opposite effect on what I think the USDA wants. It would cause the packers would be so fearful of all these regulations they would increase their own production. So you know, we have a lot of programs, as Mr. Bruner pointed out, that add value for the producer, you know, antibiotic-free, ractopamine-free, housing, all different kinds of, like, genetics that we get premiums for. And if the GIPSA was, if they implemented what was in 2010, that would be a huge problem for those kind of programs and would be detrimental to the profitability of not only large producers, but small producers, because small producers are the ones that really take advantage of some of these niche markets.
Well, thank you. And Mr. Chair, and Mr. Zimmerman, I'm going to submit for the record on HPAI some questions for you. I know that my commissioner, State Commissioner Troxler, came up to Minnesota, learned a lot from practices that were established up there, and I've got a couple of questions that I'll follow up for you, but thank you for your leadership in this area. Mr. Chair, if I appear to be a little bit frustrated, it's because I think the time is running out. We've had enough discussions. We know what the issues are. We have got to solve the biotech labeling issue. We've got to beat back GIPSA again. These are disruptive forces that do not add value, do not do one thing to accomplish any progress on food safety. All it does is put another burden on our farmers that they cannot possibly afford to have lopped on them. Thank you.
Senator Tillis, I haven't noticed any change in your demeanor at all.
That's a compliment.
Yeah. Senator Stabenow
Mr. Chairman, I do want to follow up to
Senator Heitkamp, you're next.
On this, if I could indulge, if my colleagues would indulge me, because obviously the issue that was raised on biotech is a very difficult issue for all of us who support biotechnology and production agriculture, and at the same time, through no creation of ours, there is a growing demand and actions coming from consumers. And so I just think it's important as we're wrestling with this to be clear. And Mr. Bruner, maybe you can tell us how you're affected by the Vermont law.
You know, I would not be expert on the Vermont law. We have not spent a lot of time studying it. I do know very.
It's my understanding you're exempt. Meat is exempt, correct?
That would be a very very important aspect of any efforts into genetic labeling. You know,
but I just think it's important to know that you are exempt. So there's that different kind of urgency around this because you guys are exempt from Vermont.
Well, we might also be concerned by what might follow. The precedent.
No, I understand. I just think it complicates the issue for us as we're looking. But I also wanted to just ask anyone who would want to respond that I think there's a general understanding around feed that's very important, feed exemption. And so, but the challenge that is being debated is from a consumer standpoint. If we have a can of soup that's vegetable soup or a can of soup with beef broth, and meat in it, one would be labeled and one would not be, which I think is probably more of a challenge from if we were following Vermont, which is from a consumer standpoint or from a grocery manufacturer standpoint, is a different issue when you're having to go through and sort of figure that out with two cans of soup. And one is exempt and one is not exempt. So I wonder if anybody would want to speak to how we deal with that or why that's a good idea.
Senator, very briefly, couldn't the voluntary labeling program that we already have serve that need and find out if there is a willingness for a significant enough portion of the market to pay for the cost?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I'm not going to go on and debate this more at this point in terms of voluntary and mandatory. I think what we're trying to do is how to figure out at this point what's coming at us, which is something that, you know, is a requirement, and how do we put together a balanced coalition that's going to allow us to get something done in a reasonable way that addresses very different requests and very, very different needs, and this is a tough one. So just wanted to get your perspective on this one issue that's been, you know, an issue of concern and trying to work through. Thank you.
Senator, if I may add.
Yes, sir.
I think speaking in that regard, I think we should, I mean, something needs to be done to get some uniformity and
I agree.
And less confusion for the consumer. I think as far as the beef goes, on a probably a different note here, but I do think we have to remember that these cattle that do eat GMO feed are not genetically modified themselves by eating it.
I agree. And I think there's general agreement on that. So, thank you.